So now to tonight's special guest. I would like you to imagine for a minute that you're standing in line at the supermarket, scanning the tempting array of candy bars, when your eye catches the cover of a gossip tabloid. The headline reads, "Princess Grace, Bridesmaid, living in New York shelter for homeless, photo exclusive." And you think, how awful for that poor woman. Suddenly the line begins to move again and you're jolted back to reality. The Star and its sensational headlines are soon forgotten. Unless, of course, you are Nyna Giles, whose mother is the Princess Grace bridesmaid the Star is featuring in a 2-page spread. Upon seeing this headline in the checkout of a local supermarket, Nyna, who at the time is a 29-year-old suburban housewife and mother of 2, realized that her mother's ordeal was exposed for everyone to see. But the Star reporter really know the truth behind how her mother came to live as a destitute bag lady, as described in the article? For that matter, Nyna thought, did she really understand her mother's past and who she was before becoming a long-term resident of a women's homeless shelter, unwilling to accept help from Nyna or anyone else? 29 years after seeing that jarring headline, Nyna tells the story the Star didn't in her mother-daughter memoir, The Bridesmaid's Daughter. In the book, Nyna opens up about her life as the youngest daughter of Carolyn Scott Raybould, one of the first and a highly successful model at the Ford agency, and one of Grace Kelly's bridesmaids, whose life was derailed by undiagnosed mental illness. Nyna has since traveled the globe to share her story, revealing the challenges brought on by her mother's mental condition and her own lost childhood. As a result of her experience, Nyna is a tireless advocate for the mentally ill, having served for several years as vice president of the board of the Association for Mentally Ill Children of Westchester. Nyna and her husband Peter, who is here with us tonight, co-chaired the Mental Health Association of Westchester County's 5K run walk. And recently, Nyna joined the National Alliance for Mental Illness New York State Legislative Committee. When Nyna is not speaking about her book or advocating for the mentally ill, she is the Chief Operating Officer for Giles Communications, a leading public relations company. Please join me now in welcoming the bridesmaid's daughter, Nyna Giles.
Thank you, Joyce, for the very kind introduction, and thank you, Erica. I'm delighted to be here this week, especially in light of all the wonderful things that you have going on. It's truly an honor to share my story with all of you here tonight. This is my first time speaking at a college. It's especially meaningful to me because I never went to college. Part of my story is my lack of formal education. In fact, I only attended 175 days of elementary school. The only full year of education I had in my mother's care was 7th grade. I wrote The Bridesmaid's Daughter to tell my mother's story, knowing that untreated mental illness was at the core. I wanted to uncover the truth to fully understand and appreciate what she went through in a way that I could share with the world. But in order to do that, I had to face what happened to me as a child, which has been very painful to relive day after day, year after year. My mother was a very successful Ford model in the late 1940s through the mid-1950s, best friend and bridesmaid to Grace Kelly, later in life spending years in a homeless shelter. My book is my search to understand how this once glamorous, beautiful woman fell so hard. It also goes into the impact a parent's mental illness, untreated mental illness, can have on a child. Think of all the things a child would miss by not going to elementary school. A sense of accomplishment, no friendships, that sense of belonging and fitting in. I never attended a gym class. I have no class pictures from that time. It's almost as if I didn't exist. It wasn't until I was 10 that there was a petition for neglect. It was never enforced, and even after that, I attended 5 days of 5th grade and 0 for 6th grade. This is an excerpt from my book, which will give you a better understanding of what my childhood was like. When I was a child, my mother often took me into Manhattan. She didn't trust the doctors on Long Island, so we would always drive into New York for my appointments. In photographs from that time, I'm a thin and pale-faced child with dark circles under my eyes. I never seemed to have rosy cheeks. I was prone to stomach aches, fatigue, sore throat, strep infections, all kinds of ailments and illnesses. From a young age, I knew the city was the place you went to be rescued, to be made better again. At the wheel, my mother smoked with the window cracked, tapping her cigarette into the pull-out ashtray. I sat quietly at her side, looking out, wondering what the doctors would say this time. I was accustomed to the examining rooms, with their bright lighting and silvery equipment. I knew all about wearing the little cotton gown, sitting on a tall chair with my legs swinging while the nurse took my blood pressure and the doctor pressed a cold, hard stethoscope to my back. I was very good at sitting still and sticking out my tongue. I'd had a lot of practice. My father once told me that my mother had taken me to as many as 50 doctors in 1 year. The problem was that each doctor we visited usually sent us home with a pat on the shoulder and the reassurance that everything would be just fine. I would get better soon. But my mother wasn't so easily convinced. We would have to see the next doctor and then another. We were always looking for the right test, the right medicine, the miracle cure. After each appointment was over, if I was lucky, my mother would take me to the doll hospital on Lexington Avenue as a reward for being a good girl. I had one particular Tabitha doll that I loved. The doll was modeled on Elizabeth Montgomery's daughter from the TV show Bewitched. Like me, my Tabitha was often sick. I knew I needed to take good care of her. I'd carefully give my Tabitha doll to the chief surgeon, and after a little while, Tabitha would be given back to me as good as new. As a child, I knew I wasn't so easily fixed. My mother had told me that I had internal bleeding. It was a concept that terrified me. I imagined the blood escaping my veins and seeping throughout my entire body. I grew up thinking I had a bad heart, that I had rheumatic fever, but in reality, I was fine and my mother was not. So many days I stayed home from school, resting in my bedroom. I spent my days reading and playing piano. News broadcasts also helped to break up the day. I watched the news on ABC religiously at 7 a.m., 5 p.m., and 11 p.m. I loved the handsome newscasters for their firmness, their solemn voices, and their confidence. Bill Beutel and Roger Grimsby were my heroes. No matter what happened, they took the world as they found it and explained it in terms even a child could understand. Years later, I reconnected with the daughter of one of our neighbors on Long Island. She told me that she would often ride her bike by our house to see if she could catch a glimpse of me at the window. We knew there was a strange girl who lived there, but she mostly stayed in her room because she was sickly. Our neighbor told me it was like a mystery. What was going on in there? A friend of my sister's said, "You were like a beautiful porcelain doll, a non-entity. You never left your mother's side." It has taken me years to accept what happened to me in the care of my mother and to find my voice. I would be remiss if I didn't stop for a moment and acknowledge my sister Robin. She passed away on this very day 40 years ago. January 28th, 1979. She died in a car accident. She was a singer-songwriter on the verge of becoming a star, and that month that she died, she had met with Warner Brothers about a record deal. In reality, it was my sister who saved me. She asked the question, "Do you realize that you were never sick all those years?" She was the first person to say it out loud. I was 14 years old. So this is my survivor story too, and I'm proud to say that despite the profound effect my mother's untreated mental illness had on my development and upbringing, I've had a really good life, and I did get my GED. I've been able to separate my mother from her illness. I feel nothing but love and compassion for her today. I understand mental health from all sides. My mother was as ill back as far as I can remember. My oldest daughter is developmentally disabled and suffers with schizophrenic symptoms, OCD symptoms, and over the years I've experienced my own anxiety and depression. It's the reason why I'm so passionate about mental health advocacy and why I wanted to share this story. It's been an incredible journey, over 5 years, over 100 interviews with a family I never knew, and the top mental health professionals, the likes of Tippi Hedren and Eileen Ford. I have researched and documented my mother's entire 8-year modeling career, from Steubenville, Ohio, New York City, and ultimately to Monaco and the Royal Palace. I've retraced the footsteps of my mother's entire life. She was a small-town girl who made it big. She's considered an icon of Steubenville, Ohio, along with Dean Martin. In 1947, Steubenville was celebrating the 150th year of its founding. The prettiest girl would be crowned sesquicentennial queen, and my mother won. She was offered either a Hollywood screen test or a cash prize. At age 19, she took the prize money and moved to the Barbizon Hotel in New York, where she met a young 18-year-old Grace Kelly. One of the most rewarding parts of this journey was the endless hours I spent in the Library of Congress, the New York Public Library, the Gladys Marcus Library at FRT, and many others, piecing together my mother's modeling career. The librarians would roll out these bound volumes of magazines, and I just wanted to jump up and down and say, that's my mother, because she was there page after page. It was so exciting to see all these images because I had never seen them. We had just a few images growing up that I had seen. I had no idea the scope of her career. This was her first magazine cover for McCall's, and that was shot by a young Richard Avedon. And Richard Avedon, actually, his sister was diagnosed with schizophrenia as a teenager, and it said that that influenced his career and his desire to capture tragic beauty in photos. Charm magazine, which became Glamour. These two photos are from editorial spreads that were in Mademoiselle magazine. So my mother had a regular 6-page spread in Mademoiselle for a year, every issue. And this photo was taken by Gleb Jarosinski, who actually was a Westchester resident. I've become very good friends with Gleb's daughter. She recently wrote a book about her father's career as a fashion photographer. He was very well known for his Harper Bazaar covers, and I had this picture 2 years before I realized. 2 years, we were friends for 2 years, and I realized then that her father had taken the photo, so that was pretty wonderful. It was a surprise. That's Tippi Hedren and my mother. They often worked together. Tippi was the petite blonde, and my mother was the petite brunette. So they worked together all the time. They were good friends, and actually she did stay in touch with Tippi for a while, probably until I was about 10 years old. I remember giving up my bedroom to Tippi when she came to visit. I was able to reconnect with her about 5 years ago, and we've been in touch ever since. But who was this woman smiling back at me? This was not the mother that I knew growing up. I kept searching for new insights, more information, but as hard as I tried to put the pieces of my mother's life back together, there were some pieces that didn't fit. I knew that in order to fully understand her story, I needed to figure out the point at which she first began to show symptoms of her illness. From my reading of paranoid schizophrenia, I knew that in the vast majority of cases, symptoms of the illness begin in late adolescence or early 20s. But when I met my mother's friends and family members, I always asked them if they noticed signs of strange behavior on my mother's part when she was younger, in her teens and 20s, and they always told me no. From what I knew of my mother, she only began showing signs of her illness after I was born. By then, she was 30 years old. Was it typical for someone with schizophrenia to have such a late onset? My search for an expert on schizophrenia led me to Dr. Jeffrey Lieberman, chair of psychiatry at Columbia. I hoped that if I gave him detailed information about my mother, he would be able to answer my questions. That meeting marked the pivotal moment in my journey. I told Dr. Lieberman as much as I could about my mother, about her childhood in Steubenville, her move to New York, explained there were no signs of her illness until after my birth. I brought with me the names of medications that she had taken. I explained that she'd only been diagnosed much later in my life, and throughout my childhood and early adulthood, we had no idea what was wrong with her. He asked me many questions. Did she suffer with insomnia? Did she experience any trauma in childhood? Did she have religious beliefs? Did she smoke? A history of hypochondria? I answered yes to all of his questions. I explained that by the time my mother received her diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia, she was in her 50s. She'd been taken to Kings County Psychiatric Center because she seemed to be having some kind of psychotic episode. So the doctors there would have seen a woman who was delusional. Based on the symptoms she was presenting at that time, they had no access to prior history or health records. He didn't feel that my mother had paranoid schizophrenia. He said, what you've just described to me are the classic symptoms of postpartum psychosis. I was stunned. And that's when all the puzzle pieces started to fit together. It's a severe psychiatric condition that can set in during the first months after a mother gives birth, or even the first year, and more serious than the more common postpartum depression. Women with postpartum psychosis can experience depression, mania, confusion, paranoia, hallucinations, delusions, but the delusions can take many forms. My mother never did anything deliberately to hurt me. Her delusions were only related to my physical health. In her mind, I believe that she was trying to protect me. This was not Munchausen syndrome by proxy. Dr. Lieberman pointed out that my mother may have had tendencies towards hypochondria and types of obsessive-compulsive disorder even before my birth, but the postpartum psychosis would have exacerbated those tendencies, magnifying their effect. It's temporary and treatable today, but if left untreated, the sufferer only continues to deteriorate, as my mother did. It didn't happen overnight. It happened gradually, and she just got worse and worse. We had a nanny until I was 4 or 5, and things got much worse after that. The tragedy here is that my mother could have been treated and most likely recovered. She needed treatment after I was born. My birth was traumatic. My mother was a petite 5'4". I was a 10-pound, 10-ounce baby. She had a C-section and a hysterectomy. She was in the hospital for 10 days. She'd given up her career. She was isolated on Long Island. Her friends were all in the city. Everything she loved was in Manhattan. My mother found out my father had an affair when I was just 9 months old. The perfect storm. I also spoke with one of the leading experts on postpartum psychosis, Diana Barnes. She said, as a model, your mother's whole persona was about femininity and beauty, so the hysterectomy would have been particularly hard for her. She would have felt as if she lost part of what made her a woman. She asked if my mother was sexually abused as a child. At least 6 people told me they thought that her stepfather molested her. That's the reason she never wanted to go back to Steubenville. I consulted with my OBGYN. He said, after such a traumatic surgery, it's highly unlikely that your mother could have escaped some form of postpartum depression. The doctor also told me that because I was such a big baby, the massive incision would have limited her ability to breastfeed and bond with me. It would have been weeks before the incision healed, and she would have felt in any way better. I never felt that I had the same bond that my sisters had with my mother. Your birth was the fork in the road, the turning point in her life from which she never recovered, through no fault of her own. So without realizing it, I've been an advocate since I was born. I've been passionate about mental health advocacy for so long, but I was never satisfied. I really wanted to contribute more in a meaningful way, and my book is giving me a chance to do that. Writing this book was very painful at times, and it still is. To relive my mother's sadness and my lost childhood, it was hard to break through the shame of having a mother who was mentally ill, who lived in a shelter, the shame of never going to school. But for anyone out there who's thinking of telling their story, or if you know of anyone who is, I can tell you that I've been met with kindness every step of the way. The experience has brought me gifts that I could never have imagined. A family I never knew, a rock star cousin, countless new friendships. No longer ashamed, I'm more comfortable in my own skin. It's the gift that keeps on giving. Just this weekend, I received a package with photos of my mother from a cousin, and they're photos of my mother as a teenager that I've been looking for 5 years. Last year, at Christmas, a Grace Kelly collector sent me 2 boxes of items she thought that I should have. She included a book about Grace that was inscribed to my parents by Gant Gaither. That book was in my house. I remember seeing it growing up, and somehow she ended up with it and sent it back to me. In the book, my mother shared one of her favorite memories of the royal wedding. After the ceremony, the guests were kept in the cathedral for 40 minutes. While the bridesmaids followed Grace and Ranier in a separate car, they drove through the streets of Monaco and watched as the people blew kisses to their new princess. Another friend sent an article about my mother's accomplishments as a model from an Ohio newspaper written in 1951. She had saved it all those years. I feel that I've been blessed to tell this story, to honor my mother's life with this book. But how many women's stories will never be told and never acknowledged? I know that my mother's story is not unusual, save for the friendship with Grace Kelly. All the more reason why her story should shine a light for others. And now I'd like to take you back to 1989, when our family's ordeal first became public, and the prologue of my book. The day my mother's story first slipped out into the world, I was 29 years old. It was March 1989, and I just dropped my daughter at her nursery school before driving over to my local A&P supermarket to pick up groceries. My son was still a toddler, sitting in the shopping cart, kicking his little legs as he waited for me to pay at the checkout. I remember glancing down and smiling at him as I stood on the line. He was such a sunny and easy child. I looked forward to our time alone in the mornings together after his big sister went to school and before his midday nap. My husband and I lived with our 2 young children in a nice, comfortable house in a suburb of New York, the same town he'd grown up in. I was a stay-at-home mom. I spent my days taking my children to play groups and nursery school, to their doctor's appointments in the supermarket. Our friends were my husband's college friends and their wives, people who knew almost nothing about my family or my past. I preferred it that way. I thought I could keep everything neatly in its place, the same way I cleared up the children's toys before my husband came home at the end of the day. That day at the supermarket, the woman ahead of me in the checkout was still unloading her groceries from the cart, so I turned to glance at the magazines in the rack as I waited. And that's when I saw it, the headline on the cover of one of the tabloids. Princess Grace Bridesmaid living in New York shelter for homeless, photo exclusive. I whipped around to make sure no one else had noticed. My face was on fire, my stomach tight. No one in my world knew about my mother, about the connection to Grace. Would they even guess that the woman from the headline had anything to do with me? I grabbed a copy from the rack, tucking it under a quart of milk. Then as fast as I could, I paid for the magazine and the groceries and fled to the parking lot. In the quiet of the car, I opened the magazine, searching for my mother. There she was, on page 19. Gray circles under the hollows of her dark eyes and streaks of silver running through her cropped black hair. In the photograph, she was sitting on the steps outside the shelter where she lived, wearing a thick white scarf around her neck, pausing to place a small knitted hat on her head. For the most part, the article about her was accurate. My mother did sleep each night in a homeless shelter on the Upper East Side of New York. Her bed was number 85, a small metal cot covered with a regulation blue blanket in an open dorm. Each morning at 7 a.m., the guards shook her awake and she got up and left the shelter, going to Bergdorf Goodman's department store to wash in the basins of the ladies' lounge, spending her days in the local parks, libraries, and churches. The part about Princess Grace was also true. My mother and Grace Kelly had first met in New York in 1947 when they were teenagers living in next-door rooms at the Barbizon Hotel for Women. Grace was studying acting. My mother was modeling for Eileen Ford and had just arrived in New York from Ohio. After Grace became famous, the two women remained close. And when Grace married Prince Rainier in Monaco in 1956, my mother had been at her side as one of her bridesmaids. The article went on to explain that since Grace's death, Carolyn's story had taken a very different turn. Now, only a few years after Grace's fatal car accident, Carolyn was lonely and destitute, living in a shelter. What the article didn't say was that while my mother may have been lonely, she was not alone. She had family who cared about her, who tried to persuade her to seek help, to find housing. Each month I accepted her collect calls, and my husband and I paid a local diner so she could eat her meals there. I was the bridesmaid's daughter, and while I might not have told my friends and acquaintances about her situation, I thought about my mother all the time. I worried about her, hoped that she was warm enough, leapt every time the phone rang, terrified something had happened to her. And as often as I could, I went into the city to visit her. My mother and I would meet in a little square set between buildings on West 58th Street, where she liked to sit and pray. She was religious, devoted to the Virgin Mary, and she believed the little square was blessed. I knew I could always find her there, sitting on a bench, her head bowed, her hands clasped in prayer. From a distance, no one would ever have guessed my mother was homeless. Not a hair on her head was ever out of place. Proper appearance was always very important to her. She liked to wear white for purity, white slacks, white shirt, white scarf, white tennis shoes. Together, we'd go to a nearby diner for lunch, spending the next hour or so picking at our food and trying to make conversation. My mother usually wanted to talk about astrology. She was obsessed with star signs and the movement of the planets. "The planets are colliding this week," she'd say, shaking her head. "We have to be very careful. It's a dangerous time." She was always concerned, always anxious. She had a lot of advice. If I talked about my husband, she'd tell me I should leave him. If I brought up something about my children, she told me that I should take them to the doctor. She was worried about their health. She was concerned about me, too. She wanted me to see a doctor. I didn't look well. "We need a miracle," she'd say to me. "I've been praying for a miracle for you." But when I tried to talk to my mother about what we could do to improve her own situation, how we could help her find a stable place to stay, she'd shut me down. "We'll talk about it when the sun is shining," she'd say. And that was that. She didn't want my help. More than anything, she seemed to want to be left alone. I had spent so long trying to separate myself from my mother, forging my own life in order to survive. I'd even changed the name she had given me, Nyna, spelling it with a Y to set myself apart. Now, as we sat on the opposite sides of the table at the diner, it was as if 1,000 miles stretched between us. During those lunches, we were careful to avoid eye contact. My mother looked off to either side, remaining alert to danger. I stared at my plate. I didn't want to catch my mother's eye. If I did, I usually regretted it. She had the saddest eyes I'd ever seen. After lunch, I got back in the car and drove home to the suburbs, back to the careful, normal life I had built for myself, my fortress. My mother remained living at the shelter for a decade until 1998. At that point, she developed a heart problem, which meant she could no longer legally stay at the shelter, and we were able to move her to an adult home on Long Island because of a medical issue. She spent her last years at a nursing care center where she died in 2007 at the age of 79. When my mother was alive, I never managed to learn what had made her the way she was. Why was she so removed from the world? How the once glamorous model and bridesmaid ended up sleeping each night in a shelter. It was only after she was gone that I was finally able to understand what had happened, to go back to the past in search of the woman my mother had been before I was born, and to the childhood I'd lost after everything changed. When my mother was in the Armory in 1985, there were 10,000 people in shelters in New York City. Now there are 64,000. A large percentage of them mentally ill, that the system has failed. They should not be invisible to us. This is what I know now. My mother was sick in her mind, not able to take care of herself and not able to make good decisions. She did not know she was sick, and she did not want treatment. The mental health laws prevent family members and doctors from treating people like my mother. By doing so, the mental health laws are not helping people and they are not protecting society. The legal standard for treating people is dangerousness to self or others. It should be need for treatment due to incapacity. What my mother needed was an advocate, someone to take charge of her life and intervene at every level. At that time, I was so completely uneducated about the causes and effects of mental illness, I simply couldn't be that person on her behalf. Towards the end of her stay at the shelter, I met her social worker. I forced myself to go into the room with 100 cots to see where she slept. I was able to reconnect with her a few years ago. She felt that the last years at the shelter that my mother was at peace. She wasn't agitated, just going about her business, not connecting a lot with her celebrity past. She got a lot of pleasure out of walking in New York City. That it would have been easier for her to feel anonymous in a room of 100 women, more so than having a roommate like she did when she was moved to an adult home on Long Island. I could sleep at night when she was there, but for her, she was just back in Long Island, isolated again. It was while she was there that she tried to take her own life, unsuccessfully. In a perfect world, I would love to have seen my mother handing out programs at Lincoln Center. She loved the ballet so much. Or given a volunteer library job at the Library for Performing Arts, something that would have made her feel valued. She was there every day anyway. My mother was a kind person who wanted to help others. She was always talking about miracles. She sat in her little square every day, believing that if she did, the square would one day be elevated to a shrine for humanity. This is a photo of her in that square. This is the face of untreated mental illness. This is what happens without treatment, medication, resources. It's also the reason for me why it's so important to raise awareness. The stigma and neglect of mental illness is not just an unmet public health problem. It's a social injustice no different than racial discrimination, religious prejudice, or intolerance of sexual orientation. I believe that when it comes to mental health, we can all help by engaging in real conversations, asking if someone's okay, getting beyond, I'm fine. If somebody appears to be struggling, ask the question. When the journey to write my book got too dark, a good friend of mine encouraged me to see a therapist. In fact, she actually said, "Don't call me until you do." The smallest act could change the course of someone's life. I wrote The Bridesmaid's Daughter with the intent of helping others. If sharing my mother's story achieves this goal, then perhaps that will be the miracle that she was praying for. I can't change the sadness of her life, but I can and will help others in her name. Thank you for listening, and now I'd like to open it up to questions. Thank you. I had two questions about my sisters. So I had two older sisters, 6 and 8 years older than me. Their lives were very different. They were in New York City until they were probably 6 and 8 years old, and a very charmed life. They had a nanny. They would walk Grace's poodle that Cary Grant gave to her, because she couldn't be seen by the press. When they first moved to Long Island, they had the dance lessons, the horseback riding lessons, swim meets, the perfect childhood. We lived on 5 acres of waterfront property in Lloyd Neck, on Long Island. So their lives were very different when I was, first born. And then later on, I found out that they actually had missed a lot of school too. I didn't really know that until I started getting school records. I have, everyone's school records now. But both of my sisters are no longer with us. My middle sister, Robin, left home at age 16. It was a very dysfunctional household. Yeah. Yes.
I wanted to thank you for writing the book and bringing mental health awareness to people. I think it's so important, and I commend you on bringing it.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
But is it true? I mean, I bought lessons on people with skills. And it's under the impression that 1982, the Americans of the World Region came along with all these mental health institutions. They used to be.
Even before that, I bet Michael could answer that better than I could probably, yeah.
And now everybody, I mean, I was pulled in by a mental health institution locally.
It was-
Because they have to work with them, treat them, and they don't.
There's no accommodation. There were supposed to be community mental health centers, right? And there isn't. So what you have is you have people that are homeless, in shelters, in jail, and it's a tragedy because they deserve treatment, and there's so many people that could be helped. And there are resources out there, but the big problem is housing, right? And
It's one of those things that I think people who know they have broken legs, but if they're not emotionally feeling well, they have a hard time emotionally.
Right, and that's why I say it's important for all of us, everybody in this room. We can all make a difference, because if you saw somebody with a broken leg or they were limping, you would ask them, have you had that checked out yet? We should have the same attitude about mental health. When somebody's struggling. We've all seen it.
And I think the best thing is like the
We still laugh about that, yeah. She was cutting off my lifeline, so I had to do it. Thank you. Yes. Nobody did, yeah. Well, yeah, so the question is about my father and what his role was. My father was like Don Draper in Mad Men. Literally, he was the director of marketing for Foot, Cone and Belding, J. Walter Thompson, McCann Erickson. If you think of that character, that was my father. The martini lunches, probably the affairs. He wasn't around a lot. He was also almost 20 years older than my mother. And I found it interesting that when there was this petition for neglect, that everything referred to my mother, as if there was no responsibility on the part of the father in those days. It was different. A different era. Fathers weren't as involved. But he didn't do anything. He just got angry at her for her odd behavior, but he did nothing to save me. Yes.
I just want to share, first of all, thank you for sharing. I know
Thank
you
you.
also support other families who may be struggling with a loved one.
Mhm.
Talk about the importance of peer support and helping other families through this process, which can be difficult in ups and downs. How important is that in your work?
Well, that's one of the reasons why I'm doing this now, is because my mother is no longer with us. My daughter is reasonably under control, living in a group home and on a medication that's working well for her. And that's why I feel that I should be out advocating and helping, because when you are the caregiver and you're going through this, you can't do that. And it's really important. I think often people feel like they're alone. And I know that when I took a NAMI family support seminar, that was 22 years ago, and I sat in a room with other people that were going through the same thing that I was. I didn't know that, and I didn't know how to talk to anybody about it. So it's really important to connect with other people that have been, through a similar situation, to find help and just support, to know that you're not alone. Yes. Well, because my father was so much older than my mother, his parents, they lived in Florida. I know that we went to see them when I was very young, probably the last time when I was a baby. They never visited us on Long Island. My father never really acknowledged my mother's family. He never went to visit them in Ohio if my mother went, and the feeling that I got from the relatives that her relatives from Steubenville that I interviewed was that he just had no interest in engaging with them. And they never came to visit us. There was no family. And I think part of the problem is that my mother's behavior changed, but she was away from New York, away from her family. If she had been daily around people that knew her, they would have seen that difference, but they weren't there. So, and in those days, calling somebody on the phone, you didn't do that every day. So.
You say your mother did not have Munchausen's disease, but it's interesting, did your mother treat your sisters the same way, or was it exacerbated by the time you were there?
Well, there's never anything unusual until after my birth, that I'm certain of. I did find out that my sister did miss school. In fact, my oldest sister, Jill, who was 8 years older than me, she was left back 2 years and went into 6th grade with her younger sister, Robin, who was 2.5 years younger. And I never understood why they fought so much. Now I get it. I had 3 children. I can't even imagine what the stress that would have put on them. But the reason I say I don't believe it was that, it was Munchausen syndrome by proxy or anything like that. My mother never did anything deliberately to harm me. She didn't give me medicine that would make me sick so that I'd have to go to the hospital. I think she was always just trying to help me. And I should also say, I explored all avenues. It could have been, school phobia, all of these different things. But what I know is if you took me out of that environment, I would have been fine, because as soon as I left at age 14, I was on the honor roll and I was fine. So it was a very confusing situation. It wasn't a safe place for me as a child. I was very fearful. And I think if I said I had a stomach ache, probably because I was afraid to go to school, she would then take me to a gastroenterologist. I remember saying, my heart's beating too fast. What did we do? We jumped in the car and we went to a cardiologist in New York City. Her fears were just, out of control. But I think that's different than being willing to do something to harm your child. It's a very different thing. Somebody more? Yes. Okay, so The question is, when did I leave home? I left home at age 14. That was because of the conversation I had with my sister. And once it was said out loud, and I knew that I was never sick, I could not stay there. So my sisters came up with a plan, and I moved in with my 22-year-old sister in New York City. My mother actually, my parents needed to sell their house, and they needed to be divorced and away from each other. It was just a terrible situation. My mother actually took me, I don't know if anybody here is familiar with Dalton, private school in New York City. Pretty much one of the most humiliating experiences of my life, to take me with my school records of never being to school to a private school in New York City. It didn't work. No. So I left at age 14. As far as my mother and when she became homeless, it didn't happen right away. A few years after I left home, my parents were divorced. They sold the house on Long Island. My mother had enough money to live reasonably well, not very well, but she could have managed. And within 6 months, she gave the money away to Catholic faith healers, in a variety of different ways. I would go to her apartment, and there would be stacks of envelopes with dollar bills, and so her money was gone. And she bounced around for a year or two after that. She went to Philadelphia, and eventually ended up back in New York. Sure. Yes.
Thank you so much. My opinion is that HIPAA law would be like a double-edged sword. And most of us here have experience not trying to find information about law. And you did mention that the system is set up so that we can help this population, these people. Do you have any thoughts how we can change the system, try and help this population get them to treatment?
Well, it's a big task. I know there are a lot of people trying. I'm just now getting involved with the NAMI Legislative Committee, so I can, be going with them and sharing my story for the bills that are there that they're trying to get passed. But I don't know, Michael, would you add anything to that about what it's...
Still encourage providers to request release if possible to allow the person to talk. But the other thing with HIPAA, there's nothing that stops someone from speaking to a professional about your concerns. They can't share information.
Yeah.
They can share the information. So sometimes the way professionals interpret that law, you can share your concerns, your challenges. They just can't respond to some treatment. So there's a lot of education we have to do in addition to changing the law.
Yeah. So I moved into New York City, and I did find a private school that would take me. And I was on the honor roll. I was there 9th and 10th grade, at doing very well, and for the first time in my life experiencing educational success. And at the end of 10th grade, my father said he could no longer pay for the school. As an adult now, I understand, okay, financially, perhaps he just couldn't do it. I can't be angry about that, but at the time I was. And I didn't want to go to the school that I was told I had to go to, which all I remember is yellow tile and graffiti. I just did not feel safe there. And at the time, my boyfriend, I was very much in love. I was always trying to attach myself to a family to find love and what I didn't have and hadn't experienced. He was offered a job in St. Thomas, and so I moved with him to St. Thomas. At age 16, I was working full-time, and from age 16 to 19, I traveled to 14 islands. I had an amazing life. So perhaps a different kind of education, but in a way, I can't say that I regretted it. I was very happy working. I learned a good work ethic, and I think it was also really important for me to completely separate from my family. I mean, if you think about it, really, the odds were very much against me succeeding in life. So, yeah. Yeah. And then when I came back from St. Thomas after 3 years, I got my GED. It was very important to me.
When you told those doctors, you said, not one of them ever looked at your mother and said, "Make this problem"?
I'm sure that they did, but she would just keep going to another doctor.
So she never really had a diagnosis while she was alive?
No, I know a few things about that. I know that she did go to a psychiatrist in New York. My father realized there was $3,000 missing from the checking account and that she had been going on a regular basis to a psychiatrist. So she knew that there was something wrong and she was trying to get help. So what did he do? He forbid her to go. He wanted her to go to a psychiatrist of his own choosing, and that never happened. When I got my school records, I had just stacks of, letters, communications from the school trying to get me to come to school. There was one teacher that was doing some home teaching with me for a while. Inevitably, my mother usually canceled those appointments, so I got very little home teaching. But in 4th grade, I was doing well for maybe 2 months with this woman. And when my mother wasn't in the room, she pulled me aside and she said, "Nina, you can go to school. I think you're fine." And I got very upset because, when you're that age, 10 years old, your mother is everything. And I didn't know how to deal with that. And I started to cry, and then my mother came in, and they were screaming, and it was pretty uncomfortable. And she never came back. And it was after that that the petition for neglect came about. But the school district never enforced anything. Yes.
Given how articulate you are relative to academic background, according to what you did so far, do you have any desire for more formal education past college at this stage in your life, which might really all work out?
So the question is, do I have any desire for more formal education? I'll tell you what my education is and what my college is right now. This past year, I went to 7 or 8 mental health conferences. That's my education that I never had from the U.S. and the U.K. Yep. That is my area of focus, and that's where I feel the most alive. That's where my passion is, and that's all I want to learn about. I want to spend the rest of my days that I have here advocating for other people who can't advocate for themselves. Yes?
This is just a comment. I listened to the audiobook, which was narrated by
I did it, yes.
I think you did a wonderful job.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah. Yes? Yeah. I really don't know. It doesn't make any sense. Well, actually, there's one thing that I did leave out, and that is that my mother eventually found a doctor who diagnosed me with rheumatic fever. So, a homeopathic doctor in Brooklyn. Not very fond of that man. No, because he wrote the notes. There were court hearings and all kinds of things that she was supposed to go to, and I saw in the notes that he would say they're not able to, she's too sick or something like that, so she beat the system, kind of. I don't think it would happen today. I certainly hope not. I did visit my elementary school, and I had a meeting with the vice principal and principal of the school, and shared the story with them. And it was very validating when the principal said, "Are you angry?" And I said, "Yes." Yeah, it was very interesting to be back there. So what they told me is that if something like that was happening today, they would have had a social worker and a psychologist visit the home. And I think that that would have been really important to do. It wouldn't have been hard to figure out that I wasn't sick. I only remember maybe being seen by a psychologist, that's what they should have done, once. And my memory of it was that I was against the wall and terrified. This woman was in my face saying that you should be in school. So, and I think because it was an affluent area, we were just hidden away. She was hidden away and I was hidden away with her. And months would pass with nothing, no attempt to get me to school.
So I'm just wondering about, like, you said you went to the square and prayed.
Yes.
So where was God and religion and faith in this?
Well,
If there was any,
okay, so the question is about religion, where she was with all that. I think my mother was very spiritual. It's interesting that a lot of people that have read the book relate to that, and they kind of understood how they didn't view that part of it as her being ill. They viewed that as just that she was a very spiritual person. Anybody that ever met her would say she would never fault anybody else for anything, and how kind she was and caring. And I found out also from her family that religion, was important when she was growing up. So.
What are the mental health conferences focusing on today?
Oh, well, I've been to many different ones. So. Everything from the Postpartum Support International Conference in Houston last July, and of course that's all about maternal mental health. I went to the MHA, Mental Health America convention, and every year they have a different theme. Last year it was Be Fit. It was all about physical health and mental health, I think. And I went to a really interesting conference. There's an organization called Campaign to Change Direction, and they had a conference in the UK that was absolutely fascinating, because it was people from all over the world just hearing different stories, different approaches in mental health, and that was the Campaign to Change, what was it? No, the mental health culture change, to change the culture around mental health. I went to the NAMI convention, and I mean, it's so broad, it's not about any one thing, unless you're talking about maybe maternal mental health, but most of them focus on so many different things. And one of my observations from being to so many different conventions is that maternal mental health doesn't come up, and I don't understand that. Everything else is covered, so many different areas of mental health. But the only place that I really saw it have a presence was where it was just specific to that. So I would like to see more awareness. Because also, one of the things that I heard from a lot of people after sharing my story, people will inevitably come up to me and say, oh, my mother was bipolar. She was never the same after my brother was born. Well, isn't there a connection there, something else that we should be talking about? Yeah.
I was just wondering if you have any suggestions for people to get involved in mental health.
Oh, there are lots of great organizations. MHA, NAMI, Westchester, I'm sure they would love to have new members. Yeah, there are so many groups. Yes, as far as resources, I do have a lot of different organizations and resources listed on my website. Yes. Yes, yes, oh, sorry. Yes.
Well, I can relate to your story a little bit because my mom was medically diagnosed bipolar.
Mhm.
And I think the biggest issue I struggle with is that, like, yes, like we try to push for help, but she doesn't necessarily go and like, receive help because it's not on terms. So do you really think like your mother probably would have, like, if she was pursued, like, to get help, but she was not necessarily?
Well, I think I'd give anything to be the person I am today and to go back in time to try to help her. I know it still wouldn't have been easy. I think it's important that people get treatment as early as possible. Early intervention is so important. But having a caring family member to, walk by your side to get you to treatment and make sure that people follow through, that's a big problem, right? People are released from hospitals and there's no follow-up, and they just fall through the cracks. So staying involved and having somebody who cares is so important. Yes.
Talking about how you get involved in the I works with, and
Mhm.
she's in charge of getting the walkers.
Yes.
Create the funds that gives them the opportunity to go to these wonderful events.
All of the things that they do, yeah.
So it's in May, and it's
Yes.
right on the
I'll be there. That's a great way to get involved and to meet people, that have a common, goal.
to do something, you feel like you need to do something to contribute.
And NAMI's great. I mean, they have a great helpline. I even called for my own daughter, who's 34. She's developmentally disabled, and one weekend I was away, and she wrote in a note something about suicide, and this would be like if a fourth grader wrote it. But they had to take it seriously, of course, and they admitted her to an adult psychiatric ward, and it took me 3 days to get her out. But I will tell you, I called the hotline. I spoke to the most amazing woman, and she talked me off the ledge, because I was really ready to go in there and raise hell. And she said, "No, this is how you approach it." And I really wish I knew her name so I could thank her. Yeah. But the walk is great. I mean, that's great. Thank you for mentioning that. That's, yeah.
Of this story to your children about,
Oh.
and have you had to present it together?
Oh, well, my son's an actor. And so we talked about this story probably every day for 5 years, and he's still not sick of talking through scenes and different things of how to, I mean, we're now very excited to be talking to a great director, producer, and cinematographer about doing a documentary. So my son was very involved, with the story process, sort of. They've followed everything. They've been very supportive in all different kinds of ways. My stepdaughter's an art director in London. She did the photo restorations. Yeah, they listen and they're there for me. But before I did this, they really didn't know much. Yeah. Yes. Well, I was in school just enough, perhaps, to catch the hang of it, but what really helped me is my oldest sister, Jill, gave me a book, and probably, I want to say I was around 9 years old, Nancy Drew. And after that, I had to read every single one. And my mother would take me to the library, and I'd get stacks of books. I would say that my reading level was probably higher than, because I know at age 11 I was reading a book like Serpico. What 11-year-old? Serpico. I read all the time because I had nothing else to do. Yeah, so I learned by doing, Yes. Okay.
You mentioned the other day the way a person was. It hit me that she had a very loving and giving personality. Many times the mental illness people do opiates or they self-medicate, and everyone's noticing how she slipped through. I think because she was
Yes.
And she turned it, not on herself, but to you. Not like one time.
Yeah, it's, yes, I would agree. I think I felt loved and protected, but it wasn't until I had my own children that I realized what a mother-child relationship should be like, you know, that your mother should be your cheerleader, encouraging you to accomplish things. But, yeah.
We had a son in private schools too. I would drop him off at the gate at the entrance. As soon as I turned away, he came out of the gate and played cookie. You never knew about it. As long as they got to introduce him. But
Yeah.
so don't worry, because it's more recent than your.
Yeah. Okay.
You're not totally the same.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you so much.
Wombrath is outside selling Nina's book, and she'll be signing them tonight. There's also plenty of coffee, hot cocoa, and cookies, so please enjoy. Thank you very much, everyone.